The morning alarm echoed through the metal corridors of Kepler Station like it had every day for the past 15 years. Sarah Chen rolled out of her narrow bunk and pulled on her gray work uniform. The fabric was rough and cheap, but it kept her alive in the cold depths of space. That was all that mattered now. She walked to the small mirror bolted to her wall and looked at her reflection. 35 years old, but the lines around her eyes made her look older. Her black hair was cut short for safety around the machinery. Her hands were scarred from years of repair work. This was what humans looked like now. This was what they had become. Sarah grabbed her tool belt and headed to the maintenance bay. The corridors were full of other humans, all wearing the same gray uniforms, all walking to their assigned jobs. No one spoke much anymore. Speaking too much could get you noticed. Being noticed was dangerous. The Vrex had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years. They were tall beings made of living crystal, their bodies catching and reflecting light in beautiful patterns. But there was nothing beautiful about their rule. They saw other species as tools to be used, nothing more. Earth had fallen 200 years ago. Sarah had learned about it in the underground schools that some humans still ran in secret. Her great-great-grandmother had been alive when the Vrex ships blotted out Earth's sky, when the crystal beings had walked through human cities and pointed at buildings, marking them for destruction or conversion. The Vrex did not kill all humans. They were too useful for that. Humans could think creatively when they needed to solve problems. They could work in dangerous places without complaining too much. They could build things and fix things and make things work. So the Vrex kept them alive, scattered them across the galaxy, and put them to work. Sarah reached the maintenance bay and picked up her daily assignment tablet. Today she would be working on the station's communication array. It was old Vrex technology, complex and elegant, but it broke down often. The Vrex who ran Kepler Station did not like when their communications failed. They became angry and angry. Vrex made life hard for everyone. She took the service elevator up to the comm array, 30 levels above the main station. The space was cramped and hot, filled with humming crystals and flowing light patterns that hurt to look at directly. Sarah had been working on Vrex technology for 20 years. She understood it better than most humans, maybe better than some Vrex. That was her secret. That was everyone's secret. The Vrex thought humans were simple. They thought human minds were too chaotic and individual to ever work together properly. They were wrong about that, but they had been wrong for so long that they believed their own lies. Sarah opened the access panel and began her work. Her fingers moved quickly through the crystal matrices, testing connections and replacing burned-out components. But she was also doing something else, something the Vrex could never detect because they had never bothered to truly understand how humans thought. She was leaving a message. It was hidden in the maintenance logs, coded in a way that looked like routine repair notes. To any Vrex reading the files, it would seem like normal technical information, but to the right human eyes, it told a different story. Array maintenance complete. Power fluctuation in Sector 7 corrected. Harmonic resonance stable. Signal clarity optimal. To the Vrex, this was just a report. To Sarah's network, it meant, message received, weapons cache in Sector 7 ready, network connection established, communication system under our control. Sarah finished her work and took the elevator back down. In the corridor, she passed Marcus Webb, one of the cargo haulers. He was a big man with steady hands and careful eyes. He nodded to her slightly as they passed. To anyone watching, it was just two workers acknowledging each other. But Sarah saw him touch his left pocket twice. That meant his part of the plan was ready too. She walked past the research labs where Dr. Elena Vasquez worked. Elena was supposedly just a low-level assistant, helping Vrex scientists with their experiments. The crystal beings thought she was useful because she could handle dangerous materials without fear. They had no idea that Elena understood their research better than they did. They certainly did not know that she had been stealing their secrets for years. Sarah returned to her quarters and sat on her bunk. She opened her personal tablet and began writing what looked like a letter to her sister on Titan Colony. But hidden in the friendly words about weather and work was something else entirely. The flowers in the station garden are growing well. The blue ones especially are thriving in Section 12. Maria says the red ones in Section 15 need more attention. The white ones throughout the eastern wing are almost ready to bloom. When they do, it will be beautiful. Any Vrex scanning her messages would see a human talking about plants, but her network would understand that the weapons in Section 12 were ready, Section 15 needed more supplies, and the teams throughout the eastern wing were prepared to act. This was how humans had survived, not by fighting the Vrex directly, that would have been suicide, but by becoming invisible. By letting the crystal beings think they understood humanity, while humans quietly, carefully, patiently built something the Vrex could never imagine. Sarah lay back on her bunk and stared at the ceiling. Above her, beyond the metal walls and the cold of space, were the stars. Somewhere out there was Earth. The Vrex had turned humanity's birth world into a factory, but it still existed. Humans still lived there, still worked there, still remembered. The Vrex ruled the galaxy. They had ruled it for 3,000 years, and they expected to rule it for 3,000 more. Their fleets patrolled every system. Their technology dominated every world. Their crystal consciousness connected them across impossible distances, making them the perfect rulers. But they had made one mistake. They had kept humanity alive. Sarah closed her eyes and thought about tomorrow. Tomorrow would be like today. Gray uniforms and repair work and careful messages hidden in maintenance logs. But it would also be one day closer to something the Vrex could not imagine. One day closer to the moment when the scattered humans across the galaxy would stop hiding and start fighting. The Vrex thought they knew humanity. They thought humans were useful but harmless, creative but chaotic, intelligent but disorganized. They were right about all of those things. But they had missed the most important thing about humans. When humans had nothing left to lose, when their backs were against the wall, when their choices were freedom or death, they became dangerous. Sarah smiled in the darkness of her quarters. Let the Vrex think they understood. Let them believe their perfect rule would last forever. Let them ignore the maintenance workers and cargo haulers and lab assistants who moved through their stations like ghosts. Soon enough, they would learn what humans could really do. Soon enough, the galaxy would remember Earth. The signal went out at exactly 0300 hours, Standard Galactic Time. Sarah Chen stood in the communications center of Kepler Station, her hands steady on the controls she had been secretly modifying for months. Around her, 12 other humans worked, quickly and quietly. They had practiced this moment 100 times in their minds, but never dared to rehearse it for real. Broadcasting on all human frequencies, whispered Tom Rodriguez from his position at the backup console. His voice shook slightly, but his fingers were sure on the keys. Sarah took a deep breath and activated the transmitter. Across the galaxy, on every world where humans lived and worked, the message began to play. It was not a speech about freedom or rebellion. It was not a call to arms or a declaration of war. It was just 5 words, spoken in a woman's voice. The stars remember Earth. Begin. On Titan Colony, Marcus Webb heard the message while loading cargo containers onto a transport ship. He had been waiting for those words for 3 years. He opened the hidden compartment in Container 47B and pulled out the plasma rifle hidden inside. Around him, other cargo workers were opening other containers, revealing weapons that had been smuggled piece by piece across the galaxy. On research. Station Omega, Dr. Elena Vasquez was working late in the laboratory. She heard the message through her hidden receiver and smiled. She walked to her personal locker and removed what looked like a small medical device. It was actually a virus injector designed to disrupt Vrex computer systems. She had been waiting months for the chance to use it. On Proxima mining base, Captain Torres heard the message and activated the explosives his team had been placing throughout the VREX control center for the past year. The blast lit up the asteroid like a small sun. Across the galaxy, humanity struck. It was not one massive battle. It was 1,000 small ones happening at exactly the same time. Humans who had spent decades pretending to be harmless suddenly revealed they had been anything but. Maintenance workers seized control of power systems. Cargo handlers turned their ships into assault vehicles. Research assistants used their knowledge of Rex technology against their former masters. Commander Zex-9947 was in his crystal chamber on the command ship Eternal Order when the first reports started coming. The Vrex's perfect collective consciousness allowed them to share information instantly across the galaxy, but right now that was working against them. The flood of emergency signals was overwhelming. "Kepler Station has gone dark," reported one. "Voice in the collective mind. Titan colony is under attack," said another. "Proxima base has been destroyed," came a third. Zex-9947 tried to make sense of the chaos. How were the humans coordinating such a massive attack? They had no collective consciousness like the Vrex. They had no central command structure. Their communications were monitored and controlled. It should have been impossible. But it was happening. The humans had learned something the Vrex never understood. They did not need perfect unity to work together. They could plan and coordinate while remaining individuals. They could keep secrets even from each other, making their networks impossible to completely map or destroy. Sarah's team held Kepler Station for 6 hours before Vrex reinforcements arrived. When the crystal beings finally broke through their defenses, they found the communication center empty except for a message written on the wall in human letters. "You cannot kill an idea." Sarah and her team had escaped through the maintenance shafts they knew better than any Vrex. They were already on a stolen transport ship heading for the next phase of the plan. Marcus Webb's cargo haulers had done even better. They had taken control of 3 Vrex frigates and were using them to attack other ships in their convoy. The Vrex crews had never expected their own vessels to be turned against them. Their perfect tactics had never accounted for chaos coming from within their own ranks. Dr. Elena Vasquez had managed to inject her virus into the main research network before escaping. Across dozens of Vrex facilities, computer systems began to fail. Data was corrupted. Experiments were ruined. Years of research vanished in minutes, but the humans paid a price for their boldness. The Vrex response was swift and brutal. 3. Rebellious colonies were bombed from orbit until nothing remained but glowing craters. The Vrex made sure the destruction was broadcast on all frequencies, a message to any other humans who might be thinking of fighting back. "This is the fate of rebellion," announced High Collective Czar 001 from the capital world of Vrex Prime. "Submit and live. Resist and die." But instead of crushing human resistance, the bombings only made it stronger. On every human world, in every human settlement, people watched the broadcasts and made their choice. Some were terrified into submission, but many others saw the destruction and felt something the Vrex had tried to kill in them for 2 centuries: anger. Sarah's network intercepted thousands of messages in the days after the first attacks. Maintenance workers on distant stations, reporting they were ready to sabotage power systems, cargo crews saying they had access to weapons, research staff offering to share Vrex secrets. The rebellion was spreading faster than the Vrex could track it. The crystal beings tried to understand what was happening. Their perfect algorithms analyzed the human attacks, looking for patterns and weak points. But human tactics kept changing. Every time the Vrex adapted to one approach, the humans tried something completely different. Zex-9947 studied the reports with growing frustration. The humans were fighting like no enemy the Vrex had ever faced. They had no unified command, no single strategy, no predictable behavior. They were like a virus in the body of the galaxy, spreading, adapting, impossible to completely eliminate. How do we fight chaos? he asked the collective consciousness. There was no answer. For 3,000 years, the Vrex had fought enemies, who behaved rationally, who could be predicted and countered. They had never faced an enemy that thrived on unpredictability. On Earth, in the underground tunnels beneath what had once been New York, humans gathered around hidden communication, arrays. They listened to reports from across the galaxy and began to believe something they had not dared to hope for in 200 years. They might actually win. The first phase is complete, Sarah's voice crackled through the static. Phase 2 begins at dawn. An old man named Chen Wei-Ming, Sarah's grandfather, smiled as he heard his granddaughter's words. He had been 5 years old when the Vrex conquered Earth. He had spent his entire life under their rule, watching humanity slowly forget what freedom felt like. But he had never forgotten, and now, finally, the rest of the galaxy was remembering, too. The stars remember Earth, he whispered, repeating the words that had started it all. And Earth remembers the stars. The rebellion had begun. There would be no going back now. Admiral Sarah Chen stood on the bridge of the Eternal Dominion and tried not to smile too widely. 2 years ago, she had been a maintenance worker fixing communication arrays. Now she commanded the most powerful Vrex dreadnought ever built. And it was flying under human control. The ship had cost them dearly to capture. Hundreds of humans had died in the assault, and hundreds more had been lost when the Vrex tried to take it back. But they had held it, and now it served as the flagship of the human fleet. "Status report," Sarah called out to her bridge crew. They were all humans who had learned to operate Vrex technology through trial, error, and desperate necessity. None of them had formal training in space warfare, but they were learning fast. 17 ships in formation, Admiral," reported Lieutenant Hayes from the navigation console. "All former cargo vessels, all armed with weapons we took from Vrex supply depots." "Enemy contacts?" 3 Vrex patrol ships, holding position at the edge of the system. They're not attacking, but they're watching us." Sarah nodded. The Vrex were learning to be cautious around human fleets. They had discovered that humans did not fight the way their tactical computers expected. Traditional Vrex strategy was based on mathematical precision. Calculate the enemy's strength, deploy superior force, achieve victory through overwhelming advantage. It had worked for 3,000 years, but humans did not fight mathematically. They fought emotionally, creatively, chaotically. They turned mining equipment into weapons, cargo ships into assault vessels, and industrial facilities into fortress bases. Every defeat taught them new ways to win. Every Vrex victory showed them new weaknesses to exploit. "Admiral," called Commander Torres from the tactical station. "We're receiving a transmission from Dr. Vasquez on Research Platform 7. Put her through." Elena Vasquez appeared on the main screen, her face tired but triumphant. Behind her, Sarah could see the interior of what had once been a Vrex biological research facility. Now it served as headquarters for the human intelligence network. "Sarah, we've done it," Elena said without preamble. "We've cracked their collective consciousness network." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. For 2 years, Elena had been working on the problem of Vrex mental communication. The crystal beings shared thoughts instantly across the galaxy, giving them perfect coordination in battle. It was their greatest advantage and the main reason they had ruled the galaxy for so long. "Tell me?" Sarah said. "The network isn't just communication," Elena explained, her excitement barely contained. "It's their entire way of thinking. They don't just share information, they share certainty. Every Vrex knows that their collective decisions are correct because all Vrex agree with them. They've never experienced doubt, never questioned their own actions. And I've created a virus, not a computer virus, a mental virus. It introduces doubt into their collective thoughts. Just a tiny bit at first. But doubt spreads. Once one Vrex starts questioning a decision, the uncertainty spreads through the entire network." Sarah stared at the screen. "You can make them doubt themselves I can make them doubt everything. Their tactics, their strategy, their right to rule. For a species that has never experienced individual uncertainty, even a small amount of doubt is catastrophic. How do we deploy it? Through their own communication networks. We've captured enough of their equipment to access the collective consciousness directly. But Sarah, Elena's expression grew serious. Once we do this, there's no going back. We'll be fundamentally changing an entire species. Some of them might not survive the transition from collective to individual thinking. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Around her, the bridge crew waited for her decision. Outside the viewscreen, the stars looked the same as they always had. But Sarah knew they were standing at a moment that would change everything. The Vrex didn't ask our permission before they enslaved us, she said finally. Deploy the virus. Elena nodded and disappeared from the screen. Within hours, the virus was spreading through Vrex networks across the galaxy. At first, nothing seemed to change. Vrex fleets continued their patrols, Vrex commanders issued their orders, Vrex soldiers followed their programming. But then the questions started. On the Vrex command ship Perfect Harmony, Commander Zex 9947 was reviewing tactical reports when he experienced something he had no words for. For the first time in his life, he looked at a standard battle plan and thought, what if this is wrong? The thought was so alien, so impossible, that he almost dismissed it. But doubt, once introduced, is hard to eliminate. The question echoed in his mind and spread through the collective consciousness to other Vrex ships. What if this is wrong? What if there's a better way? What if we don't understand humans as well as we think we do? The effect was immediate and devastating. Vrex, fleets that had moved with perfect coordination for 3,000 years suddenly began to hesitate. Orders were questioned. Strategies were doubted. The perfect unity that had made them invincible started to crack. Admiral Marcus Webb, leading a squadron of converted cargo ships, was the first to notice the change. His fleet was outnumbered 3-1 by Vrex warships, but instead of attacking, with their usual precision, the enemy ships seemed confused, uncertain. All ships, advance, Marcus ordered. They're hesitating. Press the attack. The battle should have been a massacre. The human ships were smaller, weaker, less advanced. But the Vrex crews were struggling with something they had never experienced before. The need to make individual decisions. When a Vrex commander sent the order to destroy all human vessels, his subordinates began to wonder, but what if some of them surrender? What if we're making a mistake? What if there's another way? The delay was only seconds, but in space combat, seconds could mean everything. Human ships slipped through gaps in Vrex formations. Human weapons found targets that should have been protected. Human tactics that should have failed somehow succeeded. For the first time in galactic history, a human fleet defeated a larger Vrex force in open combat. The news spread through both human and Vrex networks, but with very different effects. Humans celebrated and began to believe that victory was actually possible. Vrex, meanwhile, experienced something even more alien than doubt: fear. How did we lose? Zex 9947 asked the collective consciousness. But for the first time in Vrex history, the collective had no unified answer. Some thought the humans had gotten lucky. Others wondered if their tactics needed to change. A few even began to question whether the war should continue at all. Sarah received the reports in her command center aboard the Eternal Dominion. Human fleets were winning battles across the galaxy. Vrex strongholds were falling. Species that had been enslaved for millennia were joining the rebellion, bringing their own ships and soldiers to the fight. Admiral, Lieutenant Hayes called. Out. We're receiving a transmission from the Zephyrian Alliance. They want to join our fleet. Sarah smiled. The Zephyrians had been conquered by the Vrex 800 years ago. They were master shipbuilders and skilled pilots. Having them as allies would change everything. Tell them they're welcome, she said, and see if they know anything about Corvin battle tactics. If we're going to take Vrex Prime, we'll need All the help we can get. Outside the view screen, a Zephyrian fleet was approaching, sleek ships that seemed to bend light around them, making them almost invisible against the stars. Behind them came Corvan heavy cruisers, their armored hulls bristling with weapons. And beyond that, ships from a dozen other liberated worlds, all flying together under human command. For 3,000 years, the galaxy had been ruled by one species. Now, for the first time, dozens of species were working together as equals. The Vrex had united the galaxy through fear and domination. Humans were uniting it through hope and cooperation. And hope, it turned out, was much more powerful than fear. "Set course for Vrex Prime," Sarah ordered. "It's time to end this war." The siege of Vrex Prime began on a Tuesday. Admiral Sarah Chen stood in the command center of the Eternal Dominion, surrounded by holographic displays showing the most heavily defended system in galactic history. Vrex Prime hung at the center, like a crystal jewel, protected by 7 rings of orbital defense platforms and the largest fleet ever assembled. "Status report," Sarah called out to her staff. "Allied fleet holding position at the system's edge," reported Commander Torres. 2,000 ships from 47 different species. The Zephyrians are running stealth reconnaissance. The Corvan heavy cruisers are ready for assault. The Tessari bioships are prepared for boarding actions. And the Vrex response? Their entire core fleet is here. Every ship that isn't actively fighting rebellion in other systems. They've called in everything to defend their homeworld. Sarah studied the tactical display. The numbers were not encouraging. Even with their massive allied fleet, they were outnumbered 2-1. The Vrex defense platforms could destroy hundreds of ships before the Allies even got close to the planet. A direct assault would be suicide. Good thing they were not planning a direct assault. "Signal all fleet commanders," Sarah ordered. "Execute Operation Starfall in 30 minutes. The plan was insane, which was exactly why it might work. Instead of attacking Vrex Prime directly, the Allied fleet would scatter across the galaxy. While the Vrex concentrated all their forces to defend their capital, human strike teams would liberate every remaining enslaved world simultaneously. It was the ultimate gamble. If it worked, the Vrex would lose their empire in a single day. If it failed, the rebellion would be crushed, and humanity would face extinction. Admiral Marcus Webb took his fleet toward the Centauri systems, where 3 billion humans lived under Vrex control. Captain Torres led her ships to the Industrial, worlds of the Spiral Arm, where Corvan workers had been building Vrex weapons for 8 centuries. Commander Zhang's fighters headed for the Outer Rim, where dozens of smaller species waited for liberation. Sarah kept only a small force at Vrex Prime, just enough to make the defenders think the main attack was still coming. But her real strategy was happening in the shadows of the crystal planet itself. Dr. Elena Vasquez had been working in secret for months, using her network of former Vrex research assistants to map the planet's defenses from within. She had discovered something the rulers had forgotten in their 3,000 years of absolute power. Vrex Prime was not just defended by ships and weapons, it was defended by the collective consciousness itself. Every Vrex on the planet was connected to the defense network, their minds linked to sensors and weapons and shields. The planet was not just a world, it was a single vast organism, thinking and reacting as one. But Elena's doubt virus had been spreading for months, and even Vrex Prime was not immune. "Sarah," Elena's voice crackled through the secure communication channel. "We're ready down here. The virus has infected approximately 30% of the planetary consciousness. When you give the signal, we can cascade the effect." "What exactly will happen?" "Independence. For the first time in their species' history, individual Vrex will have to think for themselves. The collective consciousness will fracture into millions of separate minds. Will they survive it? Some will. Others?" Elena's voice was quiet. "The transition from collective to individual thinking is traumatic. Some minds aren't strong enough to handle sudden isolation. Sarah closed her eyes. She was asking Elena to potentially kill millions of beings. But those same beings had enslaved half the galaxy. They had destroyed entire species. They had turned Earth into a factory and scattered humanity across the stars like tools in a workshop. "Do it," Sarah said. Elena activated the Cascade virus from her hidden laboratory deep beneath Vrex Prime's crystal spires. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Across the planet, Vrex, who had never experienced individual thought, suddenly found themselves alone in their own minds. The constant background hum of the collective consciousness, a sound they had never consciously noticed because it had always been there, went silent. Some adapted quickly, their crystal forms flickering with new patterns as they learned to think independently. Others panicked, their lights dimming as they struggled to process the concept of I instead of we. But the most important effect was on the planetary defense network. The orbital platforms, controlled by minds that were suddenly questioning. Their orders simply stopped firing. Shield generators powered down as their operators wondered if protecting the homeworld was really necessary. Communication networks went silent as Vrex tried to figure out how to talk to each other as individuals, instead of sharing collective thoughts. "Now!" Sarah ordered. "All ships, attack!" The small Allied fleet that had remained at Vrex Prime suddenly revealed its true purpose. These were not warships. They were transports filled with boarding parties from every liberated species. Humans, who had learned Vrex technology, Zephyrians who could slip through any security system, Corvan warriors who feared nothing, Tessari biospecialists who could adapt to any environment. With the orbital defenses offline, the transports reached Vrex, Prime surface in minutes. Boarding parties spread across the crystal cities, moving toward the government centers where the High Collective had ruled for 3 millennia. Sarah herself led the assault on the central spire, the crystalline tower from which the Virax Empire had been administered. She moved through corridors that had never been touched by non-Vrex feet, past chambers filled with beings who were experiencing individual thought for the first time. Some Vrex tried to fight, but their tactics were based on collective coordination. As individuals, they were confused and ineffective. Others simply stood motionless, overwhelmed by the need to make personal decisions. A few approached the human soldiers with something that might have been curiosity. "What is it like?" one asked Sarah in broken human standard. "To be alone in your mind?" "Terrifying sometimes," Sarah admitted, "but also wonderful. You get to choose who you are." The High Collective Chamber was at the top of the central spire, a vast crystal room that had housed the ruling minds of the Vrex Empire. Sarah expected to find desperate rulers making last stands or final threats. Instead, she found confusion. The 12 members of the High Collective sat in their crystal chairs, their forms flickering with uncertain light patterns. They looked up as Sarah and her team entered, but there was no anger in their expressions, only bewilderment. "We do not understand," said High Collective Czar 001, his mental voice now speaking aloud for the first time in centuries. "The thoughts, they are so quiet. Where is the unity? Where is the certainty?" "Gone," Sarah said simply. "You're individuals now. You get to decide for yourselves what to do next." "But how do we know what is correct if we cannot hear all voices speaking as one?" "You don't," Sarah replied. "That's what freedom means. Making choices without knowing if they're right." Around the galaxy, reports were flooding in from the simultaneous liberation operations. Marcus Webb's fleet had freed the Centauri colonies. Torres had liberated the industrial worlds. Zhang had brought independence to the Outer Rim species. In a single day, the Vrex Empire had lost 90% of its territory. But Sarah found herself looking at the confused former rulers with something unexpected: pity. "What happens to us now?" asked another member of the High Collective. "That's up to you," Sarah said. "You can learn to live as individuals, You can try to rebuild your empire. You can join the alliance we're creating for the first time in your species history. You have choices. But what if we choose wrong? Sarah smiled. Then you'll learn from your mistakes and choose better next time. That's what freedom is all about. Outside the crystal spire, the sun was setting on Vrex Prime. For 3,000 years, this world had been the center of galactic tyranny. Tomorrow, it would wake up to a universe where no single species ruled over all others. The rebellion had succeeded. The galaxy was free. But as Sarah looked at the bewildered Vrex around her, she realized that the hardest part was just beginning. It was one thing to tear down an empire. It was something else entirely to build a better world from the pieces. Still, she thought as she activated her communicator to report their victory, humans had always been good at impossible tasks. This is Admiral Chen to all Allied forces. She broadcast across the galaxy. Vrex Prime has fallen. The Empire is ended. Welcome to your new freedom. 5 years had passed since the fall of Vrex Prime, and the galaxy looked nothing like it had before. President Sarah Chen stood at the podium in the Grand Assembly Hall on Earth, looking out at delegates from over 1,000 worlds. The hall itself was a symbol of the New Age, built from materials contributed by dozens of species, designed in a style that honored many different architectural traditions, and powered by technology that combined the best innovations from across the galaxy. The Earth outside the windows was green again. The Vrex factories had been torn down and replaced with parks, forests, and cities that humans had designed for themselves. The orbital shipyards now built vessels for exploration and trade instead of war and oppression. But the real change was not in the buildings or the ships. It was in the faces of the delegates seated before her. Humans sat next to Zephyrians, their forms shimmering with barely contained light. Corvan representatives, their heavy armor gleaming, discussed trade agreements with delicate Tessari whose bioships could adapt to any environment. Former Vrex, their crystal bodies flickering with new patterns of individual thought, worked alongside species they had once enslaved. It was not perfect. Nothing involving this many different peoples could ever be perfect. There were arguments, disagreements, and occasional conflicts. Some worlds had chosen to remain independent rather than join the United Species Alliance. A few had even tried to rebuild smaller versions of the old empire, but it was free. And that made all the difference. Friends and colleagues, Sarah began, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall and beyond to the billions watching across the galaxy. 5 years ago, we came together to tear down an empire built on fear and oppression. Today, we celebrate something much harder to achieve. We have built something better to replace it. Applause filled the hall, but Sarah noticed it was not uniform. Each species clapped in their own way, humans with their hands, Zephyrians with patterns of light, Corvan with harmonic vibrations from their armor. Even their celebration showed their diversity. The Vrex ruled through unity, Sarah continued. They believed that perfect order required perfect conformity. Every world had to follow the same laws, serve the same purpose, think the same thoughts. It was efficient, but it was also dead. In the front row, former High Collective member Zar 0001 listened with the careful attention he had learned in his 5 years as an individual. The transition had been difficult for him and his people. Many Vrex had not survived the sudden shift from collective to individual consciousness. But those who had adapted were discovering things about themselves they had never known existed. Zar 001 had learned that he enjoyed music, not the perfect harmonic mathematics that the collective had produced, but the messy, emotional compositions that individuals created. He had learned that he liked certain colors more than others, preferred some foods, and had opinions that differed from those of other Vrex. It was strange and sometimes frightening, but it was also wonderful. Our alliance is built on a different principle, Sarah went on. We believe that strength comes not from uniformity, but from diversity. Not from everyone thinking the same thoughts, but from everyone thinking their own thoughts and choosing to work together anyway. Admiral Marcus Webb, now serving as Secretary of Defense, nodded from his seat among the Earth delegation. The past 5 years had been challenging for him too, but in a different way. He had gone from smuggling weapons in cargo containers to commanding the largest peacekeeping fleet in galactic history. Some days he missed the simplicity of rebellion. Most days he was proud of what they had built. "This has not been easy," Sarah admitted. "Unity is simple. One species, one law, one way of thinking. Cooperation is much harder. It requires patience, compromise, and the willingness to admit when we are wrong." Dr. Elena Vasquez, now serving as Director of Interspecies Research, smiled at those words. She had spent the last 5 years working with former VREX scientists, helping them adjust to individual research methods while learning from their centuries of collective knowledge. The progress had been remarkable. New technologies, new medical treatments, new ways of understanding the universe, all made possible by minds that had never worked together before suddenly sharing their discoveries. "But difficulty is not the same as impossibility," Sarah continued. "Humans have never been afraid of difficult tasks. We have always believed that the impossible just takes a little longer." Laughter rippled through the human sections of the hall. It was an old joke among their species, but it carried deeper meaning now. Humans had spent 2 centuries as slaves, scattered across the galaxy and seemingly powerless. The idea that they could overthrow the greatest empire in galactic history had seemed impossible too. "Today I want to announce a new project that embodies everything our alliance stands for," Sarah said. "The Deep Space Exploration Initiative will send mixed species crews to regions of the galaxy that have never been explored. Human creativity, Zephyrian stealth technology, Corvin engineering, Tessari adaptability, and yes, VREX analytical skills, all working together to discover what lies beyond our current borders." The announcement generated excited discussions throughout the hall. Representatives began immediately thinking about which worlds might contribute ships, crews, and resources to the project. Captain Torres, who had volunteered to command the first exploration fleet, was already planning routes. In her head, the unknown regions held dangers certainly, but also possibilities. New worlds, new species, new ways of understanding the universe. It was exactly the kind of challenge that made her glad to be alive in this new age. Some of you may wonder, "Why we need to explore?" Sarah said, raising her voice to quiet the discussions. "After all, we have spent 5 years learning to live together in the space we already know. Why look for more?" She paused, looking out at the diverse assembly before her. "Because that is what free people do. They explore, they discover, they push boundaries and ask questions and refuse to accept that this is all there is." The VREX ruled a static empire where everything stayed the same for 3,000 years. We are building something dynamic, something that grows and changes, and becomes better. In the VREX section, Czar 0001 found himself agreeing with words he would never have understood as part of the collective. The idea of change for its own sake would have been horrifying to his former unified mind. Now, as an individual, he found it exciting. "The stars remember Earth," Sarah concluded, echoing the words that had started the rebellion 5 years earlier. "But Earth also remembers the stars. We came from one small world, but we belong to all worlds. We were scattered across the galaxy as slaves, but now we explore it as free beings." The applause was thunderous this time, coming from every species, in ways that created a symphony of sound, light, and vibration. It was chaos, but it was beautiful chaos, the kind that could only happen when different peoples chose to celebrate together. After the ceremony, Sarah walked through the gardens outside the assembly hall. The sun was setting over New Geneva, painting the sky in colors that reminded her of her childhood on Kepler Station. But unlike those gray, sterile corridors, This place was full of life and hope. Marcus Webb joined her, along with Elena Vasquez and several other old friends from the rebellion days. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts about how far they had come. "Do you ever miss it?" Elena asked eventually. "The rebellion, I mean. When everything was simple and we knew exactly who the enemy was?" Sarah considered the question. "Sometimes," she admitted. "Building something is harder than tearing it down. But look around us, Elena. Look at what we've accomplished." They paused beside a fountain where human children played with young Zephyrians, their laughter mixing with patterns of living light. Nearby, a group of tesserae artists worked with Vrex engineers to create a sculpture that changed its form based on the emotions of anyone who looked at it. "The Vrex thought they knew us," Marcus said quietly. "They thought we were useful but harmless, creative but chaotic, intelligent but disorganized. They were right about all of those things. But they missed the most important thing," Sarah added. "They missed the fact that chaos can be more beautiful than order, that diversity is stronger than uniformity, and that free people working together can accomplish anything." Above them, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Some of those points of light now hosted free worlds that had chosen their own governments. Others were home to species still learning what independence meant. A few were completely unexplored, waiting for the mixed crews of the Deep Space Initiative to discover their secrets. The galaxy was no longer ruled by any single species. It belonged to all who dared to reach for it: Zephyrians and Corvan, Tessari, and humans, former Vrex, and dozens of others, all working together to build something that had never existed before. It was not perfect. It would never be perfect. But it was free. And it was theirs. And it was beautiful. Sarah looked up at the stars and smiled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new problems to solve, new impossibilities to make possible. But tonight, for the first time in centuries, the galaxy was at peace, and it was a peace built not on the silence of oppression, but on the joyful noise of freedom.